You're listening to Apartheid Off Podcast, the Get to Know project. Listen and resist.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Apartheid Off Podcast. You're listening to myself, Joseph, and I'm joined by Daniela, co-hosting with me. This episode, we're joined by Alex from Palestine Deep Dive. Thanks you so much for joining us on this episode, Alex.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, this episode we're going to be covering Saviour complex politics, what people might refer to as charity politics, and where Palestine fits into this and how it's excluded in many of these narratives. And so I suppose just to kick things off, Alex, you know, how do you understand Saviour complex politics? It's a bit of a mouthful actually, but Saviour complex politics to manifest itself in liberation politics narratives, and I guess where does Palestine fit in?
Yeah, I think it's a real problem. As I understand it, or as I see it, Saviour complex politics tends to be a case where people from mainly Western countries will attach themselves to an issue, either that they're involved in or they'll get involved through.
Yeah.
Whether it's thinking of it as a career or thinking of it as something that they feel they can lend themselves to. And then what they'll do is oftentimes they will superimpose themselves onto the issue through quite you could say a Western-centric lens or Eurocentric lens in some cases. And I think what you've seen in the case with Palestine is that many people who get involved in it, who are following it, will often approach it as something that they feel they can come in and give an authentic voice to, like an authentic take, and to try and superimpose, I think, their perspective on it. And usually, I mean, whether that's done with the best of intentions or not, what it usually leads to is that the voices of the people who we should be listening to, which are the Palestinians, get erased because their voices get drowned out by those kinds of voices.
Yeah, definitely. The idea, and it just rings a bell with the idea of what you're like, not you personally, but let's say I am talking to like a Palestinian, but what they're doing is wrong. I know the right way to fix this. You just guys haven't thought of it. Let me just tell you what the right way is, and then all your issues will be solved. That kind of concept that just is so damaging because it doesn't understand the concept of what's going on and how they got there and everything behind it. And I think it's really important to be able to identify that when you're especially supporting something like Palestinian activism, but also in other forms of activism, especially intersectional ones, you need to make sure that you're centering the people that are the most affected and centering the people that are involved in it the most. You're not boosting yourself up and leaving them behind. You're giving them the platform to talk about what they need to talk about.
And I think this is maybe one place where we can kind of like begin our discussion. Is just like how we actually relate to, well, it's not relating, but how we position ourselves against Saviour complex politics. I think it's probably, well, it's definitely worth noting that like I'm white, and part of knowing that and having that privilege is actually taking a backseat to decisions that are being made within liberation politics groups, and also having the wherewithal to know that, you know, I don't have to be, and I'm not supposed to be the leader in every situation. Like for sure there might be certain contexts where, you know, it's my responsibility to speak out for the politics that I believe in and the values I hold, but it's not my role to be the one and only like leading the way for what is ultimately the liberation of, you know.
I do think that also not necessarily age, because I don't want to sound condescending and that I'm, you know, old and wise, but it comes with being able to put yourself in an activist sphere and thinking, I'm not here to boost some sort of, you know, subconscious feeling better. I'm here to actually uplift other people. I'm not trying to prove everything by being the loudest in the room and talking all my points and stuff like that. I can take a step back and know that I still can navigate this room, but by uplifting the other people in it.
Yeah, I mean, just off of that, actually, I think people should definitely read an article that Palestinian journalist Mariam Barghouti wrote a few years ago in Middle East Eye, which was about how, she said, it was about how Western journalists tend to come to Palestine, to build their careers, and then they abandon them.
Yeah.
It was a really good piece, because one of the things that she mentioned was about how among many Palestinians, this had come to be, these sort of international journalists were resented a lot because they would only ever turn up during moments of so-called, you know, unrest, as if it's just periodical, when, as we know, for Palestinians, this is a daily struggle they have to deal with, daily reality they have to face. And what they'll do is they'll turn up. Usually they will rely on Palestinians to get a certain framing their voices as one perspective, or even as a very specific voice for a sound bite. They'll build their careers and then they leave. And the problem is that the people on the ground whose voices should be center stage and what we should be hearing are often excluded and marginalized. And the interesting thing is, she said that for many of the people who do this, you actually see that they start to superimpose their own perspective and their own attempt to make sense of what's going on, but they don't do that by lifting up the voices of the people on the ground. The struggle it is.
And I think here would be a good chance to be explicit. I mean, we've kind of spoken about what those who buy into Saviour complexes don't do, but what they do, I guess, is, you know, one, they're ignoring the whole histories of, you know, dialogues and as you said, Alex, I thought if we take Palestine, what Palestinians have been saying. But the other thing that happens is that people buy into this idea that, you know, the East, the global South, to use, you know, these terms, are like need the saving of the West. And this is where like we need to really clearly understand the link between, you know, what Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden and what, you know, people see as, you know, de-civilized societies that need, you know, spaces that need saving. And they totally overlook, especially now, they totally overlook the role that colonial powers such as Britain play in forming what is the political context and, you know, the suffering of today.
And I think this manifests in lots of different ways. I remember, and kind of just jumping from what you're saying, but relating, I had a lecture a few years ago about like foreign aid and helping in different countries, and the fact that it's like complete rubbish and it's done in order for us to not give people, not allow people to develop in their own right, but also limiting them by making sure that they develop the way that we have. So going over and, you know, providing these services that are actually doing more harm for their natural environment and for what their resources that they've created. And it's just so funny because it's not funny, it's awful, but it's very ironic that we position ourselves in such a high, well, not us, but like where we live, we position ourselves in such a high class in terms of everything that we've achieved, and what we need to therefore impose onto other people, where we're mostly are the cause of it all. In one case or another, this country is the cause of it all. And so I think it's very ironic to sit back and look at the help, quote unquote, that we give others, and how it's actually damaging and how it's only needed because we then put that in place. It's interesting what you were saying before, Alex, as well, about kind of the journalists, because it just sounds awful, because in my head it's ringing bells of people that I've met that, you know, are in it for like the big scoop, or like trying to get that career defining article that will just help them out and like boost their career, at the expense of like you said, shutting down narratives and silencing stories and stuff like that. It's just, it's something that we've come across a lot, but I think is rarely spoken about.
I was just going to say, I mean, Alex, where do you see? I mean, students are obviously in this place of privilege, right? We're at university, similar to the sense that, you know, journalists can go into a space, whether that's, you know, political space, or if it's literally visiting Palestine or wherever, you know, a geographical space. But in being in these places of privilege at university, where do university students, where do students fit into Saviour complex narratives? Where should students be when they're thinking about issues that perhaps don't affect them on a local and like personal level?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that students in universities are in a position where they can organize to lift up voices to be able to speak. And I think that one of the things that hasn't been maybe emphasized enough in the past is to say that students who, if we're talking about justice for Palestine, Palestinian liberation, who get involved in that, it's good that they get involved. It's important that they organize. But what is a very key part of that is that they make sure that they recognize the position they're in, and the fact that, especially if you're talking about UK students, they probably won't face the backlash or the consequences for that organizing that, for instance, Palestinian students or other students from the Middle East might face. And so I think it's really crucial that they are able to keep that in mind and to really organize in a way that lifts voices to speak who don't otherwise get heard. And I think that it's important that they, if they do organize around that, they need to do it with a certain awareness that, you know, they have really a responsibility to be able to, not just obviously with AOC, to make sure that, you know, they look at what the university is investing in. Is their university, and therefore themselves, are they complicit in human rights abuses? But it's also important that when organizing, they don't try and obsessively control the message and the narrative of how their organizing goes out. It's important that they really make sure that, you know, the voices of the people who are affected are center stage, and that they can't be drowned out.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there in linking it to action and linking it to organization and mobilization. It's not just, you know, hearing voices, you know, in discussions, but it's also so crucial to, you know, obviously have people whose struggle it is, whose liberation it is, center when it comes to the decision making and when it comes to, you know, the actions that are taken.
I think a good thing as well that you said is not just about centering their narrative, but also like using your privilege when they don't have the access to it. So like you said, with like a Palestinian student in the UK will face far more than I will, and far more consequences for protesting. Let's say they're doing the exact same thing as I am, they will be facing a lot more consequences and backlash from either the university or from other people than I will. So it's important to obviously not cage them, and because like that's ridiculous, but obviously where you can use your privilege in order to protect others, not just by centering their narrative, but by using yourself as a means of not attack, but using yourself as a means of protection in order to allow them to say what they need to say.
I want to maybe just at the kind of end part of this conversation, what I think is really interesting as well, I was on Instagram yesterday night, and there was a kind of, UNICEF sponsored advert, and it was, I think it was like a white actor speaking, you know, please give to Yemen, it needs your support. And obviously now, you know, we've got the irony that UNICEF is actually sending money to UK children, which, you know, opens up a whole different question and a whole different discussion. But I think what's interesting to me is that Palestine's actually largely left out of these, you know, quote unquote, like, please give your money, please, you know, support these, you know, impoverished spaces, these people who really need us. I was wondering, like, why, what may be some of the factors that have led to Palestine being excluded from conversations, even of like Saviour politics? Like Palestine is just, you never see the, you know, please donate to Palestinian children, because, well, I guess, why do you think that is?
Yeah, this is something that really, really bothers me, and it's something that I noticed when I started to get involved in, when I was at uni, in activism for Palestine, is that I think that on top of the white savior narrative, what you also have is this very toxic, except for Palestine framework that seems to creep into everything. I mean, it's because it goes, I think, even beyond the issue of assisting people. What you see
Definitely.
is a case where Palestinians are systematically excluded from their own struggle, story, from mainstream debates about this issue. The fact that, as we're speaking, Palestinians in the West Bank have to face daily settler colonial violence, which manifests in a whole myriad of ways, but it's not on the nightly news. You hear cases where people are killed, and sometimes it doesn't make the news at all. Palestinian children are tortured, homes are destroyed. And then in Gaza, you have 2 million people living in what is basically what former Prime Minister David Cameron called open air prison camp.
Yeah.
And then you've got the majority of Palestinians who actually live outside in refugee camps under attack from the Assad regime, living in brutal conditions in Lebanon. They're policed in Jordan. And the minority inside Israel, which face a whole series of, despite all of that, I mean, there's more than enough voices to be able to speak about this, but you very rarely ever hear from Palestinians themselves. I mean, they're almost never on TV. And I think for me, I mean, there's so much of it. Part of it is that this is part of a political campaign to erase them and keep them out. I mean, this has been for a very long time, obviously driven by Israel and Israel's organized supporters around the world, but with active complicity from Western governments that support Israel. But on the top of it as well, I mean, anti-Palestinian racism, and especially in the post-war on terror era with Islamophobia, global Islamophobia, has allowed us to exclude them through a kind of othering, which renders them to not be trusted voices, which is so racist at its core. And that's why I would say, I mean, for students who get involved in it, and for people who want to help, I think it's crucial that they tackle that and they call out their peers who will question Palestinian stories as being biased. You know, to question, well, what do you mean by that exactly? I mean, every perspective you'll ever hear anywhere to do with anything is going to be biased in some way. But why is that? Why does that somehow exclude Palestinians from describing their own lived experiences? And I think, I mean, when I was at uni, that what I noticed actually was that a lot of times people who were very enthusiastic to support causes and issues would have this very strange reluctance when it came to Palestine. And what you saw was actually that many of the values that they claimed to live by and to fight for, and when it came to Palestinians, you had this very strange resistance. I mean, it was almost as if people were allergic to it. And when you actually got people talking, what they basically admitted was that they saw Palestine as either an uncomfortable thing that would somehow hurt their career, hurt their future prospects. They couldn't get involved in it. Or they would be quite open about the fact that they did view Palestinians in different ways that they viewed other people. And I mean, you know, I knew it with people I went to uni with. I knew it with people that I came to know. It was something that you started to see, that Palestinians were made completely invisible, and something that they were deliberately excluded from, and that their voices were viewed as a kind of danger. almost, because it would break people's sense of comfort that they put around themselves. And I mean, for me, I thought it was really disgusting, and it was something that infuriated me and always has. But I think that it's just it's a really shameful reality that we have to deal with. And I think for me, the crucial part of fighting that is to make sure that Palestinian voices are lifted to speak, because I think that they are really the key voice against that.
Yeah,
I definitely agree with what you said there, Alex. And I think it's so important to, you know, for the students listening, you know, as Alex said, call this out, like amongst your peers. You know, if you're in a position of privilege or power where you're able to use your platform to let someone else be heard in crucial moments of conversation, in crucial moments of decision making, then do that. I think it's also really important to make the links, you know, as Alex has been saying, like make the links between your local environment and the globalized nature of you know, politics and oppression. Before we end, as Alex mentioned, the article that he spoke about, we'll link that in the description below. And I just thought another noteworthy, you know, resource, that the podcast, if we can call out other podcasts, we can give them a little shout out. Diaspora Disorient, their first episode is on this same topic, and it's really informative and great discussion. And I would recommend for you guys to go listen to that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think an important thing that kind of you left off with, Alex, is make sure that you're not held back or you're not discouraged from getting into Palestinian activism, because it is so important. And the way that it's used and the way that it's portrayed in the media is massively used as a tool to stop any progress from happening. And the minute that we can dismantle that completely, and the minute that we can have these conversations and make sure we center Palestine and Palestinians, is when we can see that change. And it's so important that we do that, and no one is discouraged from that. So thank you so much, Alex, for joining us. It was actually a really good chat. And I know that me, and I can say both Joseph as well, I've really enjoyed that. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for listening to this episode of our Get to Know series.